In the last couple of sections, we have been talking about the different possible causes of changes in the demand or supply of the product. So on the demand side, we learned how things such as changes in incomes or changes in preferences of the consumers, just some of the many non-price things that can change and therefore change the demand of a product. And similarly, on the supply side, we talked about quite a lot of non-price things such as cost of production or changing technologies that can cause a shift or change in the supply of a product. Now, regardless of what the non-price factor is which is causing these changes in the demand and supply, the demand and supply together, they can only change in 4 different possible ways. That is, the demand, it can only either increase or decrease, and similarly the supply of a product, it can only either increase or decrease. And what we want to now learn is that given the demand of the product has increased, we want to work out what will be the impact on the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity of the product. And similarly, if demand decreases or supply increases or supply decreases, we now want to work out what will be the impact on equilibrium price and quantity of the product, which is ultimately the most important thing. Now, as you can see, there are just 4 different possible scenarios. As I said, demand can either increase or decrease, and similarly the supply. So we need to know that what will happen to the equilibrium price and quantity in each of these 4 different possible changes of demand and supply. But we are not going to memorize anything over here. Instead, what we are going to do is that I am going to give you a simple 4-step process, which if you follow, you can always correctly, very easily, in a very quick way, work out the impact on price and quantity when either of these changes in demand or supply takes place. And that first step of this process is where you build very quickly a rough sketch of this model of demand and supply that we have been building up in this section with such painstaking care. Now we are going to use it, because in step 1, this model is going to give us some initial assumed equilibrium price and quantity. Then in step 2, we are just going to ask ourselves which of the demand or supply is changing. So that is step 2. Step 3, once we have identified which curve changes or which of these demand or supply changes, then we are going to ask ourselves whether the demand will increase or decrease, or if the supply is changing, will it increase or decrease. Increase means a shift right of the curve, decrease means a shift left of the curve. Now once we have these first 3 steps, in step 4, we're just going back to this graph, We are going to shift the relevant curve in the right direction and read off the new equilibrium to see from this graph what is happening to price. Is it increasing or decreasing? And similarly for quantity. So this is the best approach of figuring out what happens when demand and supply of a product. What happens to equilibrium price when the market conditions change? Because you see, the examiner will create a lot of scenarios and the sort of questions he's going to ask. Now, if you just memorize a table that if demand goes up, then P goes down and so on and so forth, it's useless. You won't be able to solve any MCQs. You will just make life very tough for yourselves. So this 4-step process, let me now explain how we can use it to analyze each of these 4 scenarios. And once we know that, I will give you all the complications that the examiner tries to create, and we will see how we can overcome them. So first of all, let's start by analyzing an increase in demand. So if demand increases and we have to figure out the effect on price and quantity of a product, step 1, remember we said just sketch a quick rough demand and supply graph that would just give you the initial price P star and the quantity Q star. Now remember, this is an equilibrium because we say where demand supply crosses, that price and that quantity is equilibrium. Now hopefully you understand all the economics behind it, but here we are just going to use this model in a quick and dirty way. So just use these little concepts. This is the equilibrium, this is equilibrium price and quantity. Now if demand increases, again remember your basic concepts. Graphically that would mean demand shifts to the right. Now if demand shifts to this D2, this means that this is not our demand curve anymore, and therefore this is not our equilibrium. Where is our new equilibrium? Where the new demand crosses the supply. Supply we are assuming stays the same. So mark out as your new equilibrium this point And then read off from the graph that look, price will increase and the quantity will also increase if the demand of the product increases. And similarly, if you have to then analyze or think of what would happen to price and quantity if the demand of a product decreases, then again quickly sketch out this rough graph of demand and supply. Start with an assumed equilibrium P star and quantity Q star. And then if the demand is decreasing, just remind yourself that would mean a shift left of the demand curve. So this is going to be your new equilibrium point where your new demand crosses your supply. And read off from this graph, the price will fall and the quantity will also fall. Now I am intentionally making some very rough graphs over here because this is how I want you to practice it a few times and get comfortable with using this graph to work out the impact on price and quantity when either of these changes in demand and supply takes place. So let me do the other ones over here as well. So if supply increases, again, it's just, think of it as a video game that you have just learned how to play around with. You start with an initial equilibrium supply and demand, assume an initial price P star according to this graph and quantity Q star. If supply is increasing, increase in supply means a shift right of the supply curve. So supply shifts to the right to S2. This is not our supply anymore. So this is not our equilibrium anymore. New equilibrium is where the new supply crosses the demand. So mark it out, read off from the graph that if supply increases, the price will fall, equilibrium quantity will increase. And then the last case, what happens if the supply of the product decreases this time? Now again, same process. Start off with an initial equilibrium, price P star and quantity Q star. Now this time if the supply of the product is decreasing, decrease means shift to the left. So shift your supply curve to the left, mark out this new equilibrium point where the demand and supply are now intersecting. Read off from the graph, price will increase, quantity will fall. So instead of wasting effort trying to memorize a table that if demand goes up, supply down and so on and so forth, just put in some time and effort to understand how you can play around with this model and use it to tell you all of these 4 different scenarios and what happens to price and quantity in each of them. Because this is useful because you see the examiner is going to complicate things. He's not simply going to tell you demand is increasing, what happens. He's going to give you different scenarios, he's going to give you different graphs, and he's going to complicate things a little bit and check your understanding of this changes in market equilibrium and whether you can figure out how price and quantity changes. But in all of the complications that the A-level exam tries to create, this is basically the skill that is required. If you can work out this 4-step process, then all the complications become very, very easy. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you all of the complications that the examiner will try to create, and then I'm going to show you how can you basically use this simple 4-step process every time to answer or get to the right answers in each of the different complications that the examiner tries to create. So complication number 1 that the examiner will try to create is that he will sometimes ask you the impact on price and quantity if, let's say, both the demand and supply change at the same time. So maybe he tells you demand of a product is increasing while at the same time the supply of the product is also increasing. What will be the impact on price and quantity? Now the easy way to do that, answer this thing is that separately work out the effect on the price and the quantity of the product, first of all due to this increase in demand, and then separately work out the effect on price and quantity because of an increase in supply. So what I mean is, first pick up this increase in demand. If demand increases, the demand curve moves to the right. At this new equilibrium, the price will increase and the quantity will also increase. So let us write it down. If demand increases, the price will increase and the quantity will also increase. Then separately work out the increase in supply. Starting from an initial equilibrium, if supply increases or shifts to the right, then at this new equilibrium, the price will fall, whereas the equilibrium quantity will increase. So let us note it down here. The price will fall when supply increases and the equilibrium quantity will increase when the supply increases. Now once you have both these changes in demand and supply analyzed separately, then look at your price first and just see that because of the demand change, price is increasing, but because of the supply change, price is decreasing. So we cannot tell for sure what will happen to the price. And then look at the quantity. Because of the change in demand, quantity is increasing. Because of the change in supply, the quantity is also increasing. So we can for sure say that the quantity of the product, it will increase, but we cannot tell what will happen to the price. Of course, that would depend on whether the change in demand is greater or smaller than the change in supply. Anyhow, this is how you get over that first complication. If examiner tells you of a situation where both demand and supply change at the same time, work out each case separately and then just combine the results to see how the price and quantity will change. Now this next complication that the examiner will try to create, let's call that complication number 2, and we have already done all the work we need to get over this complication. Now what the examiner will do is that he is not going to tell you in a very direct way that demand is increasing, now tell me what will happen to price and quantity. He will sketch out some imaginary scenario. He will create a situation where implicitly he will mention some non-price thing changing in the market of some assumed product. And then he will ask you what will happen to the price and quantity as a result of whatever I have mentioned. And this is where you will need to first of all figure out what is the non-price factor that is changing, and then using the knowledge that we built in the last couple of videos of how different non-price factors, how we can analyze whether it will affect the demand or supply and in what way. All of that knowledge, you will need to use that to get to this step 2 and 3. So you will basically have to work out first of all which curve is shifting and in what direction. And then you can apply this 4th step, throw that change of the relevant curve in the right direction and read off from the graph how the price and quantity will change. But the whole trick will be to figure out, using the knowledge and ideas of the last couple of videos, that how a certain non-price change, is it going to affect the demand or supply, and in what direction will it move demand or supply. So that will be the key in those questions. So that's the complication number 2. Don't expect that examiner will be direct in asking you supply is changing, increasing to the right. No, he will try or want you to figure that out given a certain scenario or a situation. And then the next third complication